What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So since a lot of you guys like the setup video which I released yesterday, today I'm going to be doing a video on how to build a gaming PC from scratch. So we're going to be going from step 0, step by step, showing you how to assemble everything from the motherboard to the final touches, showing how to install the RAM, how to install the CPU and the GPU, aka the graphics card, fit all of the fans, a CPU cooler, and basically every component that you'll need to create the ultimate gaming PC. So this is a tutorial for beginners. I'm in no way an advanced PC builder. This is the second PC which I've built. But for everyone who watched the setup video, I also wanted to show you kind of like a guide how I did it and the whole process of building it from scratch and how I built my setup machine. So this PC build took all day to make, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. The one thing that I would say that I can't give advice on though is cable management. So if you're on this video looking for cable management advice, click off and watch a different video. But if you're here to get tips on how to build your first PC, then this should help you. I will timestamp all the parts in the video as well, so you can jump ahead to the right parts which you want to watch. So for an example, if you're not sure how to fit a CPU cooler, then you can skip forward to that and have a look at the specific segments of the video which are useful to you. So without further ado, let's get into the video. This is just going to be a step-by-step from start to finish, from building everything on the PCB, on the motherboard, fitting it into the case and getting everything working from step 0 down to the finish, and booting it up and installing Windows on it too. This will be interesting for anyone just to watch and see how the process works, or for someone who's actually looking to build one. So as you can see, these two boxes are labelled. This is the i9 CPU and this is the power supply. So I'm just going to go ahead and open these. Now, most of these have already been unsealed and opened before, which is why they're actually labelled. But I actually re-sealed them. So we're just going to throw away these pieces of paper that we don't need. And we're going to put these on the desk where we can easily access them. Now, as you can see, this is the i9 10900K, which is one of the best CPUs right now. I actually bought this version, which is the Avengers version, mistakenly thinking that it actually came with the Marvel Avengers video game, but it didn't actually come with that. The only upside of buying this is that it has an attractive box with really nice box art. But for some reason, the Avengers version, the box looks cooler, but I guess it doesn't come with the game. But it's actually much cheaper than the normal model, which is in just a normal box. So at the end of the day, I won just by getting a better price, even though I didn't get a free game that I thought I would do, unfortunately. Then next up is the power supply. So this is a Corsair power supply. I can't remember how much this cost. I think this cost £100. I'm not sure how much that is in dollars, probably 100 and something dollars. But this is going to be a little bit tough to open because I think I only opened one side of this, and then I meticulously wrapped it in hundreds of layers of tape, which I'm notorious for. Right, so as you can see, this thing is an absolute beast. If I just take it out of the box. This thing is actually super heavy too, so I'm hoping this thing actually fits. This is the Corsair RM Series RM850. So this is an ATX power supply, which should be able to fit into the machine. Now, the only reason I got this is because this is fully modular. So as you can see, all of the ports in the back, all the power cords, you can pick the optional ones which you want. And if you remember what I said earlier, that I'm terrible with cable management, this is also another reason why I got this, because I don't want to clutter the case. Because most of the time you're going to have to put the cases around the back so that they don't poke out or cause any obstructions. So hopefully that's what I'm still going to do. But this thing shouldn't have too many dangling wires like the last one that I had, because if you've not seen already by the list of parts which we're using, this is a much higher budget video. But in the last build I did back in 2017, it was pretty cheap. It was like 800, so I didn't really have a preference over which parts to pick. So this is just basically an 850 watt power supply. I believe it's a gold standard version, and it's an ultra low noise product. So this isn't by Be Quiet, this is a Corsair. You'll notice that we do have a lot of Corsair products in this video, like the case, which I'll show you soon. This is just basically an 80 plus gold certified power supply, which is super heavy, so that'll be interesting to put inside. And of course, you can't have a strong CPU without a good GPU. Now, I don't know if you can make it out, but this box says RTX 3090, GPU do not touch, important box. This is because I really didn't want people to find this box in my room and then throw it in the bin thinking it was rubbish or that it was some kind of old Amazon parcel, because the RTX 3090 is probably worth around 1600, so that would be a huge problem if that happened, and we'd probably have to go for a really old card in the case. Now you'll see with a lot of these boxes, these aren't actually Amazon pack boxes. Most of them that are in Amazon boxes came from Amazon, but they've been resealed. Now a lot of the parts later I've not touched, but I obviously have opened this because, funny story about this one, I actually ordered an RTX 3080 and I waited on the waiting list for 2 months. Nothing happened because they had terrible stock. And then suddenly I just went on Amazon one day and 3090s were in stock. So I thought, okay, this is a waste of money, but I guess if I don't want to wait till next year, I'm going to have to fold and actually buy this thing. So that's the reason we actually do have this 3090. Probably not the smartest investment I've ever made, but hopefully we won't have to replace this thing. Unless in the next 1 or 2 years Nvidia has some crazy new technology, but I'll try to hold off spending this kind of money again, at least for a while. And as you can see, here is the box. So this is the Palette Gaming Pro RTX 3090. Now, if you are actually having problems obtaining these, I would recommend actually going on Amazon, because Amazon was the last stop which I actually had success in actually getting any kind of new series RTX card. I did order them from one popular UK retailer, but they had really bad stock, especially since I was going for the 3080 model. But this one, Palette and also Zotac, I believe Zotac might be German, and I think Palette is Taiwanese or from China or Thailand. But this is an Asian brand, Palette, and Zotac is a European brand, I think, or maybe it's another Asian brand. And basically these cards, a decent amount of stock were actually available on Amazon, so I would recommend checking that out, and these more lesser known companies' versions of the card, if you do want to obtain one. So far so good. We have 3 main parts, but there's still a lot more that we need to unbox. Next up is another bag and box, which I have no clue what's inside because I haven't actually opened these yet. Now I have the idea that these are just wires, because I have ordered some brand new power cables to actually fit into this computer. I'm not really sure how many I needed and if they're the right wires, but I ordered the standard power cables which go into the back of your desktop system and also your monitors, because we are going to run dual monitors here, so hopefully I've got enough. Then some thermal paste, which is actually going to be kind of useless in this situation because the cooler, which I'm not sure which box that is even in, actually has a thermal paste pre-applied, so we're probably not going to need that, but I've just got that for a stormy day in case we need it for any problems, or if I need it later to fit something new into the computer. So 2 of the same power cables, 3 of the same power cables, 1 for the PC, 1 for both screens. So hopefully these do fit into both screens. And that's the first bag. So what's in this box? I'm thinking this box is probably the CPU cooler, because so far that's nowhere in sight, so I'm actually really curious where on earth that is. But maybe this is just more wires, I have no clue. Or maybe this is components. It looks like something Logitech. Okay, this is probably the most basic and cheapest item in this whole list. So these are probably the cheapest speakers you can get, because if you haven't noticed, some of these components are pretty high end, so I decided to get some cheap speakers because most of the time I'm just using headphones. These are just for if friends come round, or if I need someone to listen to audio, or if I'm playing a game with my brother or something and they need to hear the game. I just got the cheapest speakers possible because I like Logitech, I like Corsair, and I like Nvidia. So these are just really basic speakers for like £10. They're just called compact speakers Z120. Really basic. I actually had my last speakers as this same model, but they got really dirty and dusty, so I just bought them again. I honestly have no clue how much this weighs, but this literally contains everything else, so I'm gonna have to individually take everything out. Don't ask why I'm using a screwdriver to open these. I literally don't have any scissors or any kind of knife right now. So this is the closest thing to a blade which actually works. And it does actually work to open boxes pretty well, so. Okay, this is actually really exciting because this is another box which I haven't opened yet. Okay. First of all, I'm just going to literally remove all the packing. This is kind of worried me though, because one of the bubble air pouch things which makes the box cushioned is actually attached to a package, so I could have so easily thrown that in the bin. Okay, so the first set of things are just basic display cables. I have 2 display cables because both of the monitors support display, and I think the monitors are actually in this box too. So these are cables. I'll probably put these back in the box when I show you the components. Then I do have the cooler here, which is what we'll be using in the video. So this is the Corsair H100i RGB Platinum AIO Hydro Cooler. So I've never actually fitted one of these coolers before. I've always used those stock air cooler fans, which are really easy to install. But basically for these, just like how you'd mount additional fans, you do need to mount this in a specific area of the case. Now I've done research in my case so that I can see exactly where I'm actually going to mount this to, which is probably the top of the case. This is only a 2-fan heater setup. If it was a 3-fan, I'd probably need to put it in the front of the case, depending on the actual computer case. But this is only a 2-fan setup, so it should probably fit snugly on the top, so I'll have to look at that. Because this is only a 240mm fan, so this isn't actually as big as some of those other ones, which can go up to 320mm. So basically, this is a quiet brand, okay? This is supposed to be a quiet sound cooler, which doesn't make much noise. Obviously this is Corsair though, not Be Quiet brand. But it comes with 2 standard LED RGB fans. Basically this is an RGB pump, and you can use the special software to actually control this on the computer, which I believe is called Corsair Link. So this should be pretty interesting to set up for the first time too. So we've got a better power supply than last time, and also a better cooler than last time. So check in the description below if you do want to check out the old video from 2017 or 2018 building the last PC, because this is a far cry from that. Okay, so next up is the keyboard. I went with a basic keyboard this time because I'm not really all about name brands. I didn't really care about spending a lot of money on a keyboard. I think a mouse is a better investment than a keyboard because I do like Logitech mouses. Last time I did have a different Logitech mouse, but I've gone with a newer brand, a newer model this time. But this is just a simple EG Carbon Mark II keyboard, which is a mechanical keyboard, which mine wasn't last time. So hopefully this won't make too much noise, because mechanical keyboards are kind of a meme in the sense that they just make loads of noise when you're playing or gaming, so hopefully that won't be more of a problem than I thought it would be. And then we have this very fancy box, okay, which you think would be some really interesting hardware, but in fact this is actually a Razer product. But it's not a mouse like you think it is, it's just a basic mouse pad, and these Razer mouse pads are actually really cheap. This is the Gigantus V2, which is a soft gaming mouse mat. Originally I was going to get a desk which had a built-in mouse mat, but it was too small, so I decided just to get a basic one. Hopefully this is big enough. I did consider getting one of those really long ones, but I decided I wouldn't this time around because my last mouse mat was actually pretty small too. Not really sure what's in here though, because this was a bag inside a box, so I don't know why they packaged this up. So I guess we'll just have a look. Okay, so this is a Western Digital Blue PC hard drive. This is a 1TB drive. This is probably not going to go into this PC. I might install this into my old PC, because I want to sell it and I don't really want to sell it with the original drive. So this is just a basic 1TB, unless I wipe the other drive and sell it with the original. But this is probably going in my old PC, so this is probably not going to go in the new one. So I am going to put this back in the package. But it's interesting how these hard drives come in anti-static bags, just like all the other components do. Then we have the first PCIe component, which we're going to fit along with the others. This is an Asus wireless adapter. We are getting internet installed tomorrow, so hopefully this should be good enough. And apparently it gives some pretty good high speeds in terms of connectivity. Now this wasn't super expensive. This was around £30, and it says 300 to 433 Mbps speed. So hopefully that should be a decent wireless card. I don't usually tend to use those wireless cards. I mainly just use them kind of like a far cry if the cable for the Ethernet port breaks, or if I need to connect to Wi-Fi for any reason at all. Then more peripherals. This is the Logitech G502. So this is interesting because I actually had the G402 last time, which I still do actually have, which I'm currently in the process of selling. So this is the G502 Hero, which is basically exactly the same as the last one. The only difference is you can actually change the weights in this, and I think it has an additional button like on here or something. So it's basically very similar, but you can change the weight of the mouse. Most people don't even bother changing it, and it has a bit of a sensor upgrade, it says as well. But the great thing about these is the buttons are all programmable. You can make macros and also use scripts in the Logitech Gaming Hub software. So this is why I like Logitech mouses, because they have really good customizability with them. Talking about wireless, okay, so this room is in the loft, so if we can't get Wi-Fi very well, which we hopefully should be able to, then this is the main connection which I'm going to utilize. So this is just an Ethernet cable, but this is, I think it's 30 meters long, not 20. That was actually, I think, only £4 or £5. So that was super cheap for how long this cable actually is, which is pretty crazy stuff. As you can see by now, I have a ton of wires which are not really specific to the actual PC build itself. These are mainly kind of aftertouches. Okay, so this is one of the main components which I probably should have covered before. This is the RAM. So this is Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro RAM. So this is 2 times 16 gigabyte stick. So this is dual channel we're going for. We're going for a dual channel DDR4 32 gigabytes of RAM setup. So this is 3200 megahertz, and hopefully this should give us a little bit better memory than the last build where I had 16 gigabytes. To be honest, all you really need is 16 gigabytes, but I just went for an upgrade just because I could. But the difference between 8 and 16 gigabytes is night and day, so maybe I might notice a difference between 16 to 32 as a jump, so we'll have to test that out when I do actually go on the PC. Then we have more memory. So this time I actually went for an SSD because in the past, Windows was really slow to boot up, especially in comparison to my friend who got a really nice pre-built PC. And he had an SSD, and he always recommended me to get an SSD, and he even gave me one of his old SSDs, but I declined it and obviously said that he should give it to someone else because I didn't know how to install SSDs at the time, and I didn't have the required tools to do so. Now, that was a different kind of SSD. This is an NVMe M2 slot SSD. This is the Samsung 970 Evo Plus, which is a pretty popular model, and it has 500 gigabytes. So I don't actually need anything more than this. I think all I'm going to do is just preload Windows onto this just so it loads up quicker. And that'll also be interesting to show in the PC build to demonstrate installing it into the M2 slot as well. Then also another thing which goes into the final touches of the setup, which is probably going to be another video, which are the Razer Kraken headphones. So a lot of people in the past have used Razer Krakens. I think my friend had this exact pair, which is why I went with them, because he knows a lot more about headsets than I do, because I've always in the past just got earphones or cheap headsets. So I decided to give Razer a try. I was tempted to get the Turtle Beaches, but I decided to go with the Razer Krakens. So hopefully these should be pretty good on PC. Now they do obviously have a microphone on them, but I do have a specific microphone setup which I'm going to utilize, so that's probably not really going to help me so much with the onboard mic on the headset, but hopefully the sound quality is good for those, because that's a gaming headset, so the whole point of it is to hear sounds in games and know the surroundings, so hopefully they'll work well. Then the exact same white hard drive bag. This is basically the same as the last one, although this is actually the main drive which I'm going to use in this PC. So this is the main 3.5 inch drive which I'm going to use in this PC, and if I zoom close enough, you can see this is a 4 gigabyte Barracuda drive from Seagate, and basically it's as simple as that. This just goes into the 3.5 inch drive bay, which should be pretty easy to install in the new case that I've got. My last one was 2 terabytes, which was really nice. But I decided to go with more memory this time, especially since I have an SSD to accompany this. I thought, why not get more memory, because games are getting absolutely huge nowadays, with most games going up to 80 to 100 gigabytes, which is pretty crazy for most of the popular games from last year and this year. So I said before that I'm a pretty big fan of Corsair. For some reason I've been buying tons of Corsair products. You've seen that I've bought the power supply, the liquid cooler, the Corsair case, which I'm yet to show you, and also these Corsair LL120 fans. These are 120mm fans, part of the RGB LED series. They're 1500 RPM, and basically these are just supposed to look really attractive and light up and glow inside your case. These should be pretty nice, but I already have the fans from the CPU cooler, so I'm not sure if I'll even be able to fit these, but the case description did say it had enough fan slots, so hopefully we should be able to fit enough fans into the case, those and the cooler, because we want maximum airflow. And another thing that's important is your fan setups can either suck air out of the case or push air into the case from the outside. So we're probably going to have to do a little bit of research on what fan setup I actually want. And then the main piece of the whole computer, which is basically the base of operations, which is the MSI MPG Z490 Gaming Plus motherboard. So this is an Intel chipset motherboard, which mainly supports Intel CPUs. Now the reason I got this, if we just look a bit closer, is because this actually supports Intel Core 10th Gen. And if you didn't know about my processor, which I showed you earlier, the i9-10900K, that's part of the 10th Gen, I believe. It might be part of the 9th Gen because it's an i9, but I'm pretty sure that's a 10th Gen i9 processor. So this motherboard's important because that fits into the LGA 1200 socket. So you need to make sure that your motherboard fits into the right socket for your CPU, so that's super important. But this is an Intel board, so this should be perfect, and you can have a look at some stats on the side. So this is designed for a multi-core CPU. Obviously the i9-10900K, I think, is a 10-core CPU, which is pretty crazy. It has twin M2 slots, which is going to be super important when we actually fit the SSD, which is a big upside, and it has 1.6 times DDR4 performance, which should be good for our RAM memory. and it has high quality audio slots. Now I'm not sure how much we should trust that, because obviously most people don't get sound cards these days and we use motherboard onboard sound, so hopefully that should be good quality. And the good thing about this board, which some people like on a motherboard, is it actually has a pre-installed I/O shield. So if you didn't know, one step of installing a computer is pressing the I/O shield onto the back of the case, which is where the motherboard will fit snug into, with all of the audio ports and USBs that you can plug into the back. Now this particular motherboard, along with a lot of the ones from MSI, have a pre-installed I/O board or I/O shield on the actual motherboard. So it's part of the whole system, so you don't have to click it into the back of your case, it's just part of the board, so you click the whole thing into the case and then screw it down. So that should make things a little bit easier. And the I/O shield looks like it's quite solid material, so there's no risk of actually bending it or breaking it with normal I/O shields, which you have the problem of doing. So this should be a pretty good motherboard to hold all of our parts, and I'm just going to put that in the stack there. And then if we look over here, we have 2 gaming monitors in this box on the floor. So I'm going to take these out, just one of them just to show you. Because like I said before, these are all final touches to actually finishing the setup. So this is going to be part of the gaming tour video, which I'm going to show you after the PC build video and the unboxing video. This is a 24-inch gaming monitor. This is by EG, so it's a pretty cheap monitor make. Monitors are pretty expensive nowadays, especially if you want to get one like this, which is 144 Hz. But it's a basic 1080p screen with a 2 ms response time. So this screen was pretty good for the price. I think it was only 100 and something pounds. So it's a pretty good budget gaming monitor. And like I said, since the rest of the setup's so premium, I didn't really want to dish out on an expensive keyboard or monitor. But hopefully this should be good enough and have good levels of vibrancy and colour when we actually switch it on a little bit later. So this is basically everything we're going to use to build the PC. Now one thing which I've missed so far, which might be in one of these bags, is actually a grounding cable which we're supposed to use to stay grounded to prevent electrostatic damage to any of the computer parts. Now I'm not sure if that's actually lost somewhere in one of these bags or if it's in a different box, but that'll be really important when we actually get to start the process. Another mysterious white bag which I have no clue what is contained inside. Hopefully this is the anti-static wristband and any other accessories which I've completely forgotten. So in here we have the extension lead. So I believe this is a 6-gang extension lead with surge protection, so hopefully the computer just won't break if like there's too much voltage or something. So that's important to set it up. But what is still missing is the anti-static wristband. So I love eBuyer, but I guess they just didn't send the anti-static wristband which we needed. But there are some other ways that we can use to prevent the chance of static electricity damaging the PC components. So first of all, before we actually start the build itself, this is the case. So as you can see, I do have my trusty little screwdriver set here which I bought yesterday. It took me a long time to actually figure out how to use this thing, but it has tons of different attachments which hopefully a few of them should work when screwing in things into the PC. Now most people recommend having a specific type of Phillips screwdriver, but hopefully this set should be just what we need to screw everything in. So let me show you the PC case first, which is here, and then we'll get into the motherboard and the steps on building it. So as usual, I'm opening things with the screwdriver, which is probably not the best method of opening things, but like I said, it works for me. It's funny because before this video I hadn't actually purchased that many Corsair parts, but this PC is basically a Corsair fanboy PC because most of the main things in the computer, the case, are all Corsair components. So if Corsair is watching this, definitely sponsor us on the next build because we're definitely interested on getting some of the hardware, because some of the highest quality hardware from this video came from Corsair, but don't forget some of the others like NVIDIA as well. Okay, this thing is an absolute beast. I'm not sure how we're actually going to get it out of the box because it's wrapped in some really nice nylon bag and then this polystyrene block here which actually secures it. So I think I'm going to have to rip this, which makes me feel really bad because this is some really nice packaging right here. Hopefully we should be able to get through to it. This tower is absolutely huge in comparison to my old one. If you watched the old video, it was a small tower and there was literally no space in the case whatsoever. So hopefully this should be a complete night and day difference when we're installing all the components. Okay, this is a pain in the butt to actually get things out of the case, but that's a good thing for me because it shows just how much effort they've made to actually pack things safely. I've sold things on eBay before and packed things very meticulously and tight, and people have complained at me for putting too much packaging on items. So there is obviously people who do not like things to be overly packed, But for me, just the fact that it avoids damage in transit is super important. So this is interesting because the whole thing comes in a huge bag. So I'm going to take it out of the bag and then show you, and then I'm going to put it down on the desk. But this thing is actually super heavy. That thing definitely weighs at least a few kilograms. Just look how big that box is. So inside the box, they do have a manual as well, which we're going to hopefully refer to if we need any help on areas like where to install all the spare fans and the cooler, for an example, which is super important, and that's different depending on which case you're using. Okay, right, now we need to take this thing out of the bag. This thing is actually much bigger than I expected, and also a lot heavier than I expected. I thought my old PC was big and heavy, but in comparison to this, nowhere near as close. Okay, right, I'm just going to take this plastic covering off the front, because this is obviously to protect it and keep it nice and clean with no fingerprints and no scratches in transit. And obviously this is a tempered glass side of the case, so this is going to look really nice. You don't actually need to take this cover off, because it doesn't actually prevent you removing the standoffs or unscrewing the case. So you could leave it on as a protective covering, but most people are going to take it off, and so am I. So that's the front and the back done, and I'm already making fingerprints on this thing. Geez, 5 seconds in and I'm already smudging this thing up. And obviously both sides are actually tempered. I thought only one side was tempered glass. My last case had a small plastic window, but mostly it was actually closed up, so you couldn't actually see most of the components, which is not very nice, because if you have high-end stuff, especially with RGB lights, you want to show everything through the case. So if I just lift this up now, I'm probably scratching my new desk as well, which is something I don't want to do. Then this is the front of the case, so we just need to take off this last screen of plastic. And this is what the case looks like when we unbox it. So this is the Corsair Obsidian Series 500D. So I'm going to walk you through the case before we jump into installing with it. Obviously your case will be different, but for anyone who does buy this case, it will actually be really helpful for anybody who has the same case if you install the same parts as me, or if you want to know where everything goes. So obviously over here, this is the front USB panel. So we have the audio for the headphones and the mic jack. We have what I believe is a mini USB over here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, and 2 USB connectors and the power button. So that's what's on the front. As you can see, there is actually some stock fans on the case, so I'm not sure if we're going to replace these with the normal fans, but these are actually stock fans on the front, which you may be able to see somewhere through here. Now, one thing that I really like about this case is how these side panels actually come off. So if I just tug on this corner here, the side panel just completely slides off and it exposes what's inside, which is super cool. So if we go closer, we have a few different docking points. This over here is obviously if you want to dock 2 SSDs, for an example. And then we even have the RGB hub here to control the RGB lights on the actual case, which is super cool. This is all pre-fitted into the case and pre-wired. And these are actually in boxed cables, and they're actually labeled what they are. So this one says that it's boxed, the Pro Commander cable for smart case. So these are obviously super important, so I'm not going to touch these right now. But this is the back of the case, and you can actually see through this window here where we're going to be able to put the motherboard down and feed some of the wires through the back for a bit of cable management. So if we close this panel here and we go to the back, this is obviously where we're going to fit the Corsair power supply. These are where we're going to take out the PCI-E covers to install the graphics card. And this is where the I/O shield will go with the motherboard and fans on the back. But it's exactly the same on the other side of the case in terms of actually opening up the window. So we have super easy access inside without tampering with any screws or breaking anything. So we have some basic fans here, a 3-fan setup which just comes with the case, which is really nice, and also a lot of wires over here which come with the case too. So for an example, we have what looks to be a USB 3 connector here and a few other various cables which need plugging into the motherboard. So I'm going to close the case now, and we're going to get started on the first step, which is the motherboard and installing some of those basic components. So before we begin, there's a few things that we need to do. So first of all, we need to actually prepare the workspace. So over here we have our screwdriver set, which we have an Allen key in here, but we can just pull that to the side. We're probably not going to need it. So we've got a screwdriver set over here with a few different attachments. So this is what we're going to be using throughout the video to actually screw in all the components like the motherboard. And also, if you have an anti-static wristband, make sure to ground yourself by connecting it to either the computer, a nearby radiator, or something metal or hard which is connected to the ground. You can always occasionally touch your computer case because that's on your desk on a series of objects which is linked to the ground, so that also works too. And try to build your computer on a hardwood surface. This whole setup is actually on a wooden floorboard setup, so it's probably less risky than something like a carpet, which may produce static when you stand on it. So try to build in an area which doesn't have a carpet, and also if you can take your socks off as well, this can also help with the building process. But these are mainly just extra methods if you don't have an anti-static wristband. For the most part, if you don't do any of these, you probably won't break any of the components, but these are just safety instructions that most people tell you to do, which I recommend doing if you have expensive things like this. Putting our screwdriver set aside, the first thing what we want to do is we want to open up our motherboard box. So we're going to open the motherboard box over here and get inside to the main hub. And as you can see, when we open it up, you will have the motherboard over here, which is in an anti-static bag. So this is super important. Obviously, the anti-static bag is to protect the components as usual. So we're going to take this anti-static bag out of the box and just put it down on the surface for now, because it's in the bag, so it's completely safe regardless where we put it. And we're going to lift up the tray and see what's underneath, because usually in a motherboard box you'll have a series of other components and helpful pieces of kit which you'll need to build the PC with. So we have an awesome MSI sticker logo, which we're not going to need, which is pretty interesting. Then we have the disc, which is probably going to be used for the motherboard drivers, which we can install after if you don't have a driver utility. So first of all, in the bottom where all the components are, we have a nice little MSI badge which we can use. Then we have the driver utility disc, which we're going to use to install the actual motherboard drivers once we get onto the computer. That's super important. Some random ads and promotional offers in here which we're not going to bother reading. And interesting information on the standoffs on the case. So it's important before installing this specific motherboard, which is a Z490 Pro motherboard, to install the necessary mounting standoff required for a motherboard on the mounting plate in the case. To prevent damage to the motherboard, any contact or unnecessary mounting standoff between the motherboard circuitry and the computer case is prohibited. So this is just to make sure that you don't have any extra screws which are pushing on the motherboard. So this is important that you measure it up and check what exactly you need before we're going to put it in the case. So there's also information on AMD CPUs. If you're using this case for an AMD CPU, you will need to have a different bracket to actually install it. There's warranty information. And this is just a quick installation guide, okay? So it talks to you about how you can actually install specific things like Intel CPUs and AMD CPUs. So an Intel CPU is probably the most easiest thing. It's just a drop and replace mechanism. But for AMDs, you're going to have to do some extra steps, which I'm not going to be showing in this video because this is an Intel guide. So this is actually really important stuff, and it shows us some instructions. So if we skip any steps later, or if we come into any errors, then this will be really important that we refer back to see what we haven't connected. So that's going to be on the side. You want to keep that with you just in case you accidentally skip a step in the video, or if your motherboard requires any extra steps. Obviously, you do have the main user guide which you can go through. This usually comes in all motherboards. If you have any problems with this, I really recommend reading this, especially as a first-time person setting it up, because it will give you the core information that this video may not explain as in depth as a whole manual, so that's really important. And then we have an extra pair of SATA and data cables which come with the motherboard too. So that's the contents inside the motherboard. So there's literally nothing else in the box. So what we're going to do now is we're going to close this up, and we want to put it in a position where when we put these things to the side that came with the motherboard, we can put the anti-static bag on top of the motherboard box. Now this is important because then we actually have a surface to work on. You can put it on your desk too, but for the most part it's a lot better to put it on the box because it's not a hard surface. It's hard enough, but there's some flexibility to it, so if you press down it's less likely to break your components than if you did it just directly on your desk. So we're going to open up the bag now, and then we're going to lift this out and try not to actually touch any of the components if you can help it. So I'm going to touch the I/O bridge over here as I take it out, and we're just going to lift this up and put it on top of the box, and try to be a little bit more gentle with it if you can, without touching any of the core circuitry because you don't want to damage it. Now we have our board over here. So there's a first set of components which are the easiest to install into a computer first, which we can just do directly onto the board without putting it into the PC case. So the first few, which I'd recommend for us actually to set up first, are the M2 SSD, the RAM and the CPU. So first of all, a lot of people do these in different orders, and it really does not matter which order you do these in. So I'm going to obviously start off with the i9, so we're going to install this directly first. So we're going to do a bit of a zoom into the motherboard to show you how we do this. So this is the main part, what we want to focus on the motherboard. So we need to lift up this little latch here and pull it to the side and lift it up, and this will allow us to lift up our CPU cover. And you may have this cover here which is actually supposed to be on the tray, which mine has come off before I opened it. So in here, what's important is you need to line up your CPU so it fits directly on the pins that it should do. So first of all, I'm just going to go ahead and open the CPU box and unseal it over here, and then we'll go inside the box and get it out. CPU boxes, they're just literally one tray with a small manual, usually promotions or art, like this one's a special edition one, and inside will just be the CPU box over here. So we're going to pull this latch up here to open the box and then gently lift out the CPU inside. So it doesn't matter how advanced, how good, how bad the CPU is, they all just look the same, they're just a small chip like this. And inside we can take it out, but be super careful when you take it out because you do not want to touch the pins underneath. Now that we have our CPU out, we can lift it like this underneath without touching what's below on the bottom. And usually in the corner of the CPU, which is here in my case, there's usually a little triangle that you can see which you need to line up on your motherboard. And as you can see there where the green is, there's just a little tiny triangle in the very corner which we really need to look at so we can line that up to where it's supposed to go on the actual motherboard. So as you can see where my triangle was that I just showed you, that needs to be lined up with this little dot here. In the corner there's a little dot, sometimes there'll be a triangle, that's where the CPU needs to face, that exact direction. So we can lift it here with our 2 fingers without pressing on any of the pins, and we should be able to just gently line it up and drop it down into the case. So now this seems to be snug and fit into the case. What we're going to do is we're now going to lift down the bracket like so and close it up like we did before. So now that's completely latched down, and that's how to install the CPU. Now, a normal CPU fan, what you would do is you would get your thermal paste and apply a pea-sized amount onto the top, and then you would follow the instructions on how to fit your fan on top of that. But since we're using a specific liquid cooler model, which we're going to do a little bit later in the video, this is a completely different process to what we're doing. So now we fit the 10900K by lining up the triangle and circle adjacently in the right position. So we're going to move on to one of the other easy components to set up. So next up we're going to install the 970 Evo Plus, which is the NVMe M2 SSD. So we're just going to open this up and then I'm going to show you the right connectors which we need to use on the motherboard to connect this in. And here we have the SSD which we're going to need to fit. So before we fit this, we're going to have to unscrew one of the brackets which will allow us to actually get into the area that we'll need to install the SSD into. So it depends on the type of SSD. I'm installing into the M2 slot, but if you have a different type of SSD, you will connect it on a mount on the case and then plug it into a data cable or a SATA cable. So it's a lot different depending on the kind of SSD which you're using. This is an M2 SSD, so you can follow these same steps if this is the type which you're trying to install. So as you can see, this panel here is what's going to allow us to get into the slot. On a lot of motherboards, the M2 slots are just completely uncovered, so you can install them anyway. But on the MSI Z490 Pro, we have to unscrew this bracket and lift it up to get access to the components below, which in our case is the M2 slot, which we're going to need to install this specific component. Now try not to drop your screws. I made a little mistake there. You can put them in a tray. I'm just going to put them in my little screwdriver tray to the side, because we are going to need to remember the right screws so we can install this bracket back on. I'd really recommend using a screwdriver that's magnetic when you're actually building a PC, because if you don't have a magnetic screwdriver, then you're going to end up losing a lot of your screws if you're really not careful. So I'm going to place that bracket to the side, and now I'm going to lift my SSD and install it straight into the slot. So I'm going to be using this port down here, not the other one which I showed you before, which is the one closest to the CPU, because this has no cushion in here, so I can sit the SSD flush with the motherboard. I've gone ahead and taken the liberty of unscrewing the standoff on the third screw slot. So now I should be able to actually push the M2 SSD straight into this slot down here, and then press it down and re-screw in the standoff. Plug the SSD in and push it down and balance it on top of this little screw standoff here. And then you have to get the right screw and then screw it inside that standoff from the top to secure it in place, and then you're going to screw down the actual cover on top of that. This is the screw size which you have to screw it down with, which is absolutely tiny, and it comes in a really small bag with only 2 or 3 of these, which is buried at the bottom of the motherboard case, and it's so easily to overlook it. So I'm going to press it down and screw it in. This is why you need a magnetic screwdriver, exactly for these reasons. And then just screw it in and secure it into place. and make sure it's not too tight because you don't want to apply too much pressure into it. But that's the correct way to install the M2 SSD. And then just screw the back plate on, which we screwed off before, back on top so that we can hide it under this shroud where it doesn't have to be inside. And we've installed the M2 SSD, just as simple as that. You need to actually balance it on the standoff as shown in the images here, and then screw it in on top to place it straight and secure. So we'll be installing the Corsair Vengeance DDR4 3200 MHz 32GB of RAM today, and this is a pretty popular model. And we're going to be installing 2 sticks, so this is going to be a dual channel setup. So you need to refer to your motherboard and the manual to see which slots you need to fit this into. Now, usually most motherboards will require you to fit both sticks of RAM, if you're using 2 for a dual channel setup, into ports 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. So these are the 2 that you're going to want to install them into. So as you can see, these are actually pretty big RAM sticks, a lot bigger than the ones I had before. So I'm going to take these out of the box. Obviously, still be careful with the circuitry on these and only hold them by the sides, but they're a little less risky than a lot of the other components in terms of safety. So these are the RAM slots. So you will have 4 different individual RAM slots, and most of the time they'll be labeled on one of the sides on your motherboard, and usually there'll be a diagram on your actual motherboard itself that will show you which slots to install them into for dual channel support. So if I just turn the box round, I can actually show you what it says on the motherboard, because it does actually have a diagram on it, like I said. So as you can see, it shows the 4 slots here, and it asks you to install it into 2 and 2, which basically means 2 and 4, like I mentioned, and that's what you install it first into. So install it into 2 and 4, and then obviously if you install the rest of the RAM sticks, you can add one into the 1 and 3 in the future as well. So super simple stuff to install them into RAM. You just press down these side little latches. So I'm going to do that for 2 and 4. We're going to actually get our RAM out to fit into the slots, as you can see over here, which is the great reason why you want to get a set kit of the exact same RAM, and you want to lift it so it lines up with the slots. One side is longer than the other, so if it doesn't line up you will have to spin it round. And you want to just push them down and the latches will automatically close. So as you can see, I was being a little bit overly careful there because I was just double checking that they do actually fit. This is important because when you order your components, you want to make sure they have the exact same connectors for your motherboard, because otherwise it's going to be a huge problem when you figure out that the parts don't actually have any compatibility. So my particular RAM, in terms of the way that the motherboard's facing, faces down this way with the logo of the Vengeance Pro. So I'm going to fit this into the 4 slot, and then we've completely fit both of our RAM sticks into the board. And with a little bit of force and a clean press, we've now installed the RAM, and as simple as that, it's probably the easiest component to fit, probably easier than the CPU. So now that we've done the most basic of the components, which we can easily just do on the motherboard before we actually fit into the computer, we're going to put the case face down so we can actually put the motherboard down into the case and screw it in so we can actually get to work on it. So now inside here you'll see that we have a ton of different wires which we're going to be able to connect, and we can see through to the other side of the case, and we have a few wires which have already been cabled together to prepare us to actually use the case. Now you'll see this particular case here has a few different flaps, and these flaps are for cable management so that we can actually push the cables through, which is something that I really like, and it's a feature that I didn't have in my past case. There's also the fan cover over here, which we'll be able to take off to screw additional fans or a radiator onto, which we should be able to get into doing later. So there'll be a specific number of standoffs depending on how big your board size is, and also depending on the orientation of your actual board. So for an example, is it a mini ATX or an ATX or any other kind of board which requires a different case, or some cases support multiple board types, but you'll need to use additional or less standoffs depending how big your board is and what the orientation is. So we have a standard ATX board which is obviously supported by this case, so we're going to have to measure up which of these that we need to unscrew and which of them which we need to keep in. This also does support micro ATX though, if you are planning on using that motherboard type as well. So when you're lifting up your motherboard, you have to make sure that you hold it by the sides and any big plastic components on top that you can use to grip it, because you don't want to touch any of the capacitors or any of the things below, because you may actually damage it. So this will go flat down here in a few moments because we need to line it up flush with the back of the case. So I'm going to have to just undo some of these cables and route them into the other side of the case so we actually have a little bit of space to work here, because a lot of these wires are actually trapping me from getting inside this case and putting my motherboard down, because they're a big obstruction right now. When you get a new case, there'll be case wires in there which you'll need to connect for the fans. So you're gonna have to connect fans to the fan header ports, and you're gonna have to connect things like USBs for the front USB ports and audio ports for the front audio. So there will be wires inside the case, as well as the ones that come with the motherboard that you'll need to connect. And then later, of course, we're gonna have to connect the power supply and all of the power cables, which we need too. So Corsair have bundled together all these cables really nicely, so I'm already regretting having to completely undo them and basically trash up this case. So hopefully we should have enough room without removing these cables, but I am going to have to press down these cables into the other side of the case, which I will probably have to reroute into these cable management ports in a few moments. But I will have to do that when I go to the other side of the case. Okay, so I'm going to have to reroute those cables back in, but now we should have space for our motherboard. So now we can actually kind of gauge how many of these standoffs we actually need to screw in our board. So I'm going to align it up to this small back plate. You would have to do your IO shield before you do this, but for me personally, it's already on the motherboard already. Now you just need to look at the holes on your motherboard. As you can see here, 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 and here. So there's probably 2, 4, 6, around 6 holes in this particular motherboard. And you need to look at the location of where these holes are and line them up to the standoffs below. Once you've done this, you can look at the ones which aren't connecting to your board and then unscrew them from your case, because you may damage your board and it may cause extra friction if they're just sitting there and they're not needed, or if they're brushing against your actual motherboard. So personally, I need 1, 2, 3 on this side and 1, 2, 3 on this side. So these two in the middle here can be completely removed because I do not need them at all. So for anyone wondering, what's important is there's 2 cardboard boxes on the very back of the case. You may miss these, or you may wonder what they're for if you have the Obsidian 500D like I do. But inside, you'll have a series of different screws and bolts and everything you need to actually install things into the case. And you have things like cable ties here to actually have better cable management. So if you're wondering why there's no motherboard screws or certain components which are just missing and you think your case hasn't come with it, then this is because you'll need to look on the back side of the case to find the various components that should come with it. Now, if you're terrible with cable management like me, you may want to use these cable ties, so we'll probably look towards using them at the end of the steps. So I'm going to lift our motherboard into our case, and we're going to install it by placing screws on all of the standoff connectors inside the case. Try to hold all the plastic mounts because we don't want to touch the components if we don't have to. And if you have a pre-done IO connector, if you have a pre-done IO board like me, then you will need to align it up to the holes and put it down onto the motherboard like so. So now what we can do is we can get those screws which were missing in action before we found them and screw them into the case. So you want to place these screws on the main mounting point, which we can see in our case for where the holes are on the motherboard, just so we can actually fasten it into place with a case so it doesn't fly off. Now I wouldn't apply too much pressure because you don't want to actually break it, but I'd recommend doing even pressure. So we're actually going to start at the corner points and do each corner one after the other, so each corner has even pressure applied by putting a screw in each corner. This will prevent putting too much pressure in certain spots and prevent causing any damage to the actual board, like snapping it, or putting too much pressure in certain areas which will make it more likely to get damaged later. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually connect some of these wires which have come with the PC here. So you can see there's a few random different wires here, so we're going to fit a few of them into the right slots. So try not to get all the wires tangled because you'll have to untangle them later, which will be annoying when you actually have already fitted them into the case. So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to install the hard drives into both of the 3.5-inch hard drive bays. So I've actually prepared both, the 4TB from before, which I showed you, the Seagate, and then the 1TB Western Digital, which I wasn't initially going to use, but just for the purpose of this, I'm actually going to install both. So basically you have to fit these into your case's hard drive bays or cages. Now you'll need to refer to the case's manual to see where these go. I've been referring to my case's manual because it gives good insight onto the Obsidian 500D's placement of all the parts, but it will be different depending on what case you have. This case has a caddy system with hard drive cages which is mounted behind the motherboard on the rear end of the case, which is the side that we're looking at right now. And then after that we'll have to feed through some data and SATA cables to actually connect them to the computer, which we're going to do later. I'm basically just mounting them in these slots right now, and we'll sort out all the cables a little bit later. So first we're starting off with the 4TB one, because obviously this is the first hard drive bay. So we're just going to fit this in here. Now, one thing to note is that you can actually just push these in for the most part, but there is actually screws which need to go inside it. So now on this side of the case, there's not actually screws in all these holes. That's because a few of them fell out earlier, because this is where the cardboard boxes which contain all the components will originally be. And when you pull them out, you'll usually pull out some of the screws and the rubber headers to them as well. Now when you fit these, you can actually screw these out because these are full bays, so you can actually take these standoffs out to pull it out of the case to actually fit it in properly. That's what you're supposed to do. Push it out like that and pull it up and pull out the cage, and that's how you're supposed to actually fit it in. And then we can open up our second hard drive, which is in an anti-static wrapper, and we can fit this like the first one, but we can fit this a little bit better because the first one we didn't exactly fit as good as we could do. So it needs to be in the bay, which is completely open, so we have access to the cables to actually plug it in, so data and SATA. If we put it here where the bay has this little peg and hole, we're not going to be able to plug anything in, so that's super important. Now in my particular case, the Corsair 500D, the mounting options for the hard drives are kind of limited. If you want to face up the hard drive up like this, like a lot of people want to do so they can see it through the case, then you're going to have to literally push it in and have these screws kind of hanging over it. Now I've showed you that as an example because that's not how you're supposed to do it in this particular case, but in your case it might be facing upwards like this one is. So basically I'm going to take out the hard drive caddy once more, and I'm going to show you what the real fitting should be. So basically these screw pegs should line up with the holes for your hard drive that are on the side. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, they're supposed to line up and actually plug in, but the only way to do that is if you have your hard drive upside down like this. Otherwise it's just going to be kind of floating a few inches above, and when you shut the case lid it won't actually shut properly. So it needs to be facing up in this specific case, but for your case it may be a little bit different with the orientation. So as you can see, these holes should match up to these little screws which peg into the side, and you want to try and pull out this plastic a little bit, which is quite flexible, and try to line up these screws, which should automatically click in, and then your hard drive is flush with the bottom of the tray. And then what we can do, like we did before, is slide this back down here so it's flush with the case and not covering the wire, and then we can get the standoff from before, which we put to the side, and screw it back in. Although I'm calling most of these things standoffs, this is a thumb screw, but it's the thing which we use to secure the hard drive into the 3.5-inch bay. And remember, if it's hanging up and flapping like this is because you haven't actually connected the bay into the back few holes to secure it in the front, which I'm going to show you now. So in this case, this tray has a few different hole pegs here, as you can see, and these go into these small little pegs, so they should be lined up before you actually put it in and screw it back in. And when you push it back, it should make a sound and click, and that's when you know that it's properly secured. So I'm just going to repeat this same process for the other one, with the boarding facing down where the connector's here, and I'm going to do this for this same tray as well, and fix the screws and rubber mounting. And optionally, if you want to install your SSDs into these two slots, you can here. There is a third different slot, which is currently occupied by this Corsair fan controller. There's 3 2.5-inch drive bays and 2 3.5-inch drive bays. So that's how to do that. So I'm going to switch this case back round, and what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the power supply and put it into the case and try and power up what we can so far. Now as you can see in this case, if you look over here, there's a little bit of a rubber opening which is for cables, that's for the power supply cables, and this is a shroud for the PSU. So this case has a complete metal casing which covers the PSU, so that's the PSU shroud. Most cases have them that are very similar, they're not really open. So now we're going to open up the RM series power supply and fit this up. So this is fully modular, so I'm probably going to feed most cables in and just see exactly what we need. And this is our 850 watt RM850 PSU, which is going to go into the back. Now as you can see, some PSUs will have a little bit of a sticker going over the power connection. You can read this if it's important, but this just talks about it being silent operational. So I'm just going to pull this off, and it's currently set to 0 for power, but this will stick at the back of the case so you can switch this on and off when you need to, and then put your 3-pin power connector into it when we turn the PC on and actually test it. Now whether you want to face it up or down is really your choice, but depending on your case and your airflow setup, that's how you're going to decide that. Now obviously, as with all components, the PCU will come with a guide where you can read on all the setup and important information on safety and using the hardware. I would recommend for the first PSU that you get, just get a non-modular PSU or a semi-modular one, because if you buy a modular one like I did, then you're going to have tons of cables in here that you're not going to know what to do with or where to plug them into. I'd recommend checking a specific PSU guide or the guide for your specific product to figure out which cables you'll need and where you need to plug them. But of course, I will show you how to connect the various cables into the motherboard, but you'll have to look at the setup of your PSU on what to plug into what hole. But for the most part, a lot of them are already labelled on this specific model, so we can see what goes into what, and then we can plug them in appropriately. Now what you can actually do before you actually plug the PSU in is you can actually plug the power cables into the various slots and then feed it through the little rubber cable management hole and then route it back into your PSU, and then that way you can figure out which wires you're going to need before you actually connect them. So as you can see, the first cable what we're going to fit is the CPU cable. This is just the CPU power cable, so what this will do is it will go into the motherboard in the CPU power slot. As you can see, it's just labelled CPU, and then there's actually a slot which you may be able to see down here, if you can see where my hand is. There's actually two different slots down there. So look on your motherboard where it's labelled CPU power, and then we're going to plug this cable into the first CPU power slot. There's more than one CPU power slot, so do remember that you can also plug in a second cable into the other one too. So exactly where we installed the CPU power 1 cable earlier, there's a CPU power 2 cable, and you have to install a CPU cable into it. Now the CPU cables will actually split into two pieces. So as you can see, these kind of just break apart, and we can put that into the slot next to it as a single wire. And then we can press that in, and that will go into the power supply too. So as you can see, this is going to be a little bit of a shaky camera, but we're going to start installing some of the case wires. So on this side, we have a few wires that come with a case. So I'm just going to grab them and untangle them and start to show you which ones go where. So the first one is HD audio. There should be a slot somewhere down here which says J audio 1. This is where the HD audio cable fits, so you just need to fit it in there. Now this has two rows of holes which connect to the wires down on the J audio 1 connector. And as you can see now, I have connected the HD audio cable into the J audio 1 slot down here on the motherboard. So now we're going to fit some other wires, and you want to make sure these aren't touching too closely to the motherboard. But next we're going to fit these 4 primary cables, which are probably going to have people confused. So the 4 cables we're going to connect next are pretty important too. So it's power LED plus, power LED minus, reset SW, which basically means reset switch, and also the power switch. So these cables are probably the most annoying to fit because they're all separated, as you can see, in a clump. But you need to actually put them basically in a 2x2 shape and group them together and fit them into a certain set of ports. Now these cables go into the JFP1 connector down here on the motherboard. So it's pretty hard to actually show you where these are going with the current lighting, but I am going to put a diagram on screen to show you exactly where they're located so you know how to actually put them in. But yet again, these may be facing different ways or in different slots depending on what your motherboard is. Next up is this cable, which is the USB 3 cable. Now this is strange because in this case it's a completely black cable, but these are usually completely blue. The way to distinguish them is usually they're blue coloured on the rubber or plastic tip on top of the cable, and then the connector is also blue too to make it clear what you're connecting it to. In this motherboard, in this case, this connector is just completely black, so it's a little bit different, but the likelihood that your cable's blue is pretty high. The USB 3 goes into the JUSB 3 slot, which is here. And like I said before, it should be blue, but in this motherboard's case, it's just a normal black slot, which we can just fit the wire in snugly. It's best to fit all the motherboard wires first before you mess around with the power supply. Jumping ahead to the power supply step is only recommended for professionals because it just clutters your case with so many wires that you just don't know really what you're doing whilst you do it. And this one will go into the JUSB 5 labelled on the motherboard. These two slots are here, JUSB 5, which is the smaller cable, If you're curious what the name of the second cable was, we did the USB 3, which is a thick one, and then the other one is called the USB 3.1 Type-C that not all cases will support, but if you do have that, that's the name of that connection. The next cable we're going to install is the 24-pin ATX cable. Now, there's a large connector right next to the USB 3, which is over here, that this cable will slot into. This, of course, goes into the power supply, and it's a pretty long cable. These two pieces go into the PSU, which we're going to connect later, but we're just going to slot this into the motherboard for now. There should be a little bit of a tab that you can lock down on the back, a little bit of rubber to hold it in place. So any power cables I'm fitting, I'm just putting them to the side of the case, as you can see at the top over here, just so that I can prepare them to connect them later. Now, an even better idea would be to route these power cables through to the other side. So I'm actually going to fit the RTX 3090 right now. So this is the first expansion slot that we're going to install. So I'm actually going to fit the RTX 3090 now. Now I've already done an unboxing of this graphics card if you want to check that out. And this specific one actually requires a mount to actually support it in the computer. So this is going to be pretty important. Then there's also a special double set pin connector which will go into the PCU. So let's get it installed. So to install a PCI-E card, we need to install them into these ports over here. Now these are the secondary PCI slots, these black ones, which you might be able to see. The vision from the camera's point of view is missing one of them, but there is actually 4 different PCIe connectors here. But this is the main primary one with the silver drive bay. So all we do is we open this latch and we're going to install it in here. The first thing we have to do is we have to take off these screws on the side. Now this is very different based on every different case, but these are thumb screws on this case. We're going to lift up the first few thumb screws just so we can open up the plates at the back to actually fit the card in, because the whole point of this is so that the connectors on the back of the graphics card and the other PCIe expansion hardware will poke out the back of the PC so we can plug wires into them. And anything that you want to pull off, you can just pull out and it'll expose the back of it through the back of the computer. Now it really depends the width of your card which you'll be installing and how many of these which you're going to want to remove. For the 3090 you're going to need an absolutely huge case, and also these wires are basically in the way because this thing is an absolute titan. So I may need to unplug some of these wires and plug them back in once we actually fit this thing in. And since this thing's so huge, it basically removes all ability of plugging anything into the second PCIe slot which is located under this. So I'm actually going to unplug the USB cables we plugged in earlier and move these cables to the side so that we can actually fit it in. Now this takes up 2 expansion slots, this specific card, so you'll need to usually take out 2 of the PCIe bays in the back. I would recommend fitting the graphics card last if you have a really beefy graphics card like this, because in this particular motherboard it's going to cover up the 2 different connectors for SATA, the JUSB 3 and the system fan headers, so we need to fit those first. Plus the 3090 also has a bracket which we need to fit too to support it, which won't work when we're moving around and flailing the case to fit the other things. I've installed the graphics card how I mentioned to do it before, and then what I've gone ahead and done is use the screw that we took out to make space for the 3 slots for it to fit in, and then screwed that back into the graphics card so it puts it in place. All you have to do is push it down and match the connectors and apply some force to press it into the motherboard. I have a multi-LED SATA cable here which is from my power supply, and these are the cables which plug into the hard drive. Now this multi-LED SATA cable wire has multiple SATA connections on the wire itself. So what we can go ahead and do is plug in the bottom and the top hard drive at the same time in one wire, and then feed it through the case really nicely through this little hole into the front side where we can put it into the power supply. So now you see that the SATA is plugged into the bottom right section of the front of the hard drive which we put in the bay earlier, and also the bottom SATA cable, since it's in a link of multiple ones, is plugged into the second drive too. This cable which I just plugged in is a SATA power cable which plugs into the hard drive and then plugs into your power supply. The picture on screen is actually a SATA data cable, which is the second cable you'll need to plug into your hard drive, which then plugs into an area on your motherboard. Make sure to plug this in too, otherwise the computer will have power for your hard drive from the SATA power, but it won't actually have a data cable to detect or even let you use the hard drive when you power up your PC. So what I've done is I've taken the liberty of installing the radiator with the two mounted fans onto the Corsair 500D. It was an absolute nightmare to actually fit this together. It took me around 2 or 3 hours just to figure out and piece together the CPU cooler and mount it to the top of the case. So if anyone's wondering how you can fit it into this case, basically there's a backboard which is in front of the dust filter on the top, and you unscrew it and then screw the radiator to that from behind and the fans to the front of the radiator. And then I fit the actual cooler module on top of the CPU. I haven't specifically covered how to fit an RGB cooler in this video because each one has a different mounting method and a different power source method as well. A lot of wires in the case will have these connectors here which look very similar to this. This is a SATA power cable, so basically what you need to do is you need to get the SATA power cables from your power supply and plug them into these. So an example would be over here. This is the cable which routes to my power supply, which is a SATA cable. And these cables here, just like this other one here, plugs into the SATA cable from the power supply. And then the end of the power supply cable will route into the actual power supply block if it's not already plugged in, because this version of the power supply, the modular one, we have to plug everything in manually. So we just find where it says peripheral and SATA and we plug that in. So we need to repeat this for every single SATA connection that requires a power cable going to the PSU. And after we've set up all the power and done some cable management, we would literally just put it through the side of the case or the back and mount it in the case. Obviously there's a specific direction which you may want to mount your fan. My personal case requires cool air to be taken in from below the computer into the PC, so the fan will be facing down in my case, but maybe you'll face it up depending which case you use. So over here on the motherboard is the 24-pin connector. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is get the power supply cable for the 24-pin header, which has two different plugs that go straight into the PSU side, and this big long 24-pin block which goes straight into the motherboard. Some PSUs you'll be able to separate these two blocks, as you can see. On this specific PSU cable they are glued together, but this goes straight into the motherboard, and there should be a little bit of a rubber latch which you can press down when you apply it. And then I'm going to route this to the back of my case where all the really super messy, horrible looking wires are, so I can put it into the power supply. Now on the other side I have the two wires which should feed into the power supply. So if we find the area, it should say 24-pin ATX. The small one goes in here and the big one goes in there. And now we have fit in the 24-pin ATX connector. I've already shown how the SATA cables work, but they work exactly the same for hard drives too. So we can just plug one of them into the hard drive here, which will give it power. We can lead down this cable and plug the other one in the second hard drive too. And then we also plug the hard drive into another SATA port on the power supply. This is going to look pretty on the front, but it's going to look abysmal on the back side because I'm just not made for this cable management nonsense. As you can see, once you plug in the RTX 3090 into the PCI slot, the first slot of your motherboard, you will see that they have some interesting connectors. Now the palette cable specifically that came with this model of graphics card gives you an extender cable that actually lets you put in a normal PCI-E cable, which is this from your power supply, into the white one, which is basically a converter, and it converts it into a bigger port which you can plug into the RTX 3090. Now this is because not all PSUs support these extra length PCI-E connectors which the 3090s mostly require. But the Corsair PSU which I have has an optional little clip that we can clip on to extend the cable. So I can easily just extend the cable and plug both of these when we clip them together into the 3090 to make the complete cable. But do note that the graphics card only comes with one converter cable, so if you don't have these in your power supply and you need to use the converter, then you might need to buy another converter, because I'm not sure if you only need to use one converter cable or two, because there is two PCIe slots on this graphics card. So now that they're all safely connected, we would route this through one of the cable management ports which you've seen earlier. For an example, one of these which you may not be able to see, push it through to the other side and plug this into one of the PCIe slots in our power supply. So along with the graphics card which we've just installed, we're going to install this HD60 Pro capture card. So So if I just open this up, we install this exactly the same as any PCIe connector, such as the graphics card, but the other PCIe connectors in the computer are a lot smaller than the one which we use to install the GPU. Basically what I'm going to use this for is to use the camera that I'm recording with right now to route it in via HDMI to the PC to get a clean face camera. So as you can see, we have the HD60 Pro in here, which I'm going to unbox. And it's a very small card because it has to fit the small second or third PCIe slot. We can't access the main second port because the RTX 3090 is just absolutely huge. The great thing about this little Elgato piece of kit is it does actually come with a HDMI cable with the piece of equipment, which I wasn't sure of before, which is why I actually bought a HDMI cable already. We're just going to open it up out of this anti-static wrapper and then put it back on the wrapper. And you'll see that it does actually have a front panel which you'll need to install too. As you can see, this front panel will sit flush on top of those two HDMI ports. So basically we have to screw this over the card and then put this one through the PCIe port. So now we've taken off one piece of the back plate and we can move to install the card itself. You may sometimes need to take out two of these back PCI plates. Sometimes you can always screw them back on later if it doesn't take two ports, but some of them will require two plates to be taken off to actually install, and then you can place one of the two plates on top. And as you can see, we've now placed it in, so we can place the bracket back on top, and then screw on the one below with the screw that we use to take off the bracket. If you have big hands, building PCs can be a real big problem, just like what I'm experiencing, but with a little patience and persistence, you should be able to screw these pieces back on. And don't do them too hard, just do them to thumb level, and press this down so it's straight, and then we can just screw this on too. Now if you were to install a third PCIe card, for an example, another expansion piece, like this piece of kit here, which is a wireless Wi-Fi adapter, you can fit it exactly the same. Now I'm not sure if we'll actually have enough space in here to actually fit this, but we're going to give it a try. Now this is very small because obviously it's supposed to fit in the smaller PCI port, which is one of the 2 or 3 lower ones which you'll have on your motherboard, and it will of course have the 2 antenna which you connect to the back of the case and screw on, but we can leave those till when the computer's finished. So now we have our Wi-Fi adapter installed, our Elgato installed, and our GeForce RTX 3090 graphics card. These are all connected via the PCI ports, and the RTX has PCI power routing straight to the power supply. The other smaller cards don't need any kind of power cables plugged into them, they just route directly into the motherboard. It's honestly not the most perfect thing in the world, but it looks pretty clean on the front side. But I want to show you just how horrible the cables look on the back. Obviously this has a double tempered glass side panel setup, so you'll still be able to see the horrendous cables on the other side, but luckily this side will be the one that looks really cool, especially when it's turned on and illuminated when we get this thing switched on. So the time has finally come to actually turn on the power supply, so I'm going to put these really small screws in the back in these 4 different holes each corner, and then hopefully once we screwed this block in, which we slid in from the side, now that it has all the cables here, which this is the absolutely horrible cable management which I talked about earlier, which hopefully I'll try and fix with a few cable ties in a few moments. Then hopefully we can plug these in and test to see if it works first before we actually close up the case fully. And then we're going to plug the cable into here, the power cable, and switch it on and see if it boots up. Oh my god. So since the PC actually works, I'm going to have to actually plug some stuff into it to actually test it out. So I'm going to plug in the Logitech And I'm also going to plug in the keyboard because we don't really need any sound or any of the other stuff just yet, just to test if it works. And the beast lives. Look at this, the fans are working. It was switching off constantly, but now it hasn't switched off. So I think I've actually got it to work. There was a problem with one of the USB headers being incorrectly placed, but I think everything should be fixed now. So I'm going to try and set up the monitors and see if I can get it to work. That sweet moment when you actually finally get Windows installed and it's on the final set of instructions. I've actually had a mind-blowing epiphany, which I can't believe I did not realize earlier. I've just realized that the CD which came with the motherboard, where you download and install the drivers off of, I won't actually be able to use because I don't even have a 2.5-inch drive bay or any kind of CD drive, so I can't even use this CD, which is fine because I never even use CDs in computers anyway. But that means that I'm going to have to download all the drivers online, which is a good thing because now I do actually have internet. So that's going to be the next step to boot it up. So since I've freshly installed the system, I can't actually connect to the Ethernet, and since the Ethernet doesn't work, I can't connect to the internet, and Wi-Fi is not working either because I need to actually figure out the Wi-Fi adapter drivers too. So what I've gone ahead and done is, luckily for myself, I have a laptop over on the other side of my room as well, which is already connected to Wi-Fi. So I've downloaded all the drivers which I'm going to use for the computer. So I have all the MSI motherboard drivers that makes all the Intel things work and makes the Ethernet work and fixes all the audio. So hopefully we can connect to the internet. Then I have the Wi-Fi driver, which is the PCI-E Wi-Fi driver, the driver for the Elgato HD60 Pro, so we can capture camera and video footage, and also the GeForce Experience to get the graphics card drivers. So if you have a CD drive, unlike me, then you can use all the CDs which come with the boxes that have older drivers, so they'll be a bit outdated, but at least you can install them. But for me, I had to switch PC and download them all manually off the internet. But at least the positive side is, even though it took longer, these drivers will be new. The only problem is you do have to restart after installing all the drivers. So when the option's available, I'm just going to press restart later, because then that means that I can go down the list and install as many of these as I can. And there's tons to go through, so we're going to skip this process, but you're going to have to always do this when you build a PC, install all the drivers, because you might turn it on and wonder, why is my Ethernet not working? Why can't I connect to the internet? Did I do something wrong with the motherboard? Well, you didn't. It's just because your computer doesn't have the drivers installed. So I already need to restart this, and I've only installed the normal chipset drivers for the motherboard. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and restart this. I'm going to probably have to restart the machine multiple times to actually get all the drivers installed, but once it's all set up and working, then that's the last step of getting the PC online. So now I've actually finally got the internet working because I've installed a Realtek Ethernet driver, so I can actually access the internet and connect to the modem, which is super sweet. So now the next step is to install the NVIDIA GeForce Experience so I can get the right drivers for the RTX 3090. And then once the graphics are rolling, we've basically got everything done and we can add the final touches to the setup. One slight roadblock which I've actually hit is so many of these drivers which I'm trying to install are incompatible with this version of Windows, because I've actually gone ahead and installed an old version of Windows because that's the only one that would fit on my 4GB USB stick. So I'm gonna have to do the dreaded Windows update and probably wait for like 4 hours to actually get to the final latest update of Windows. So I'm gonna have to sit down and update this 2020 update version, probably from November or something, download all of this stuff I don't need, like Windows Defender, and probably fix a lot of my drivers and components, which is great, but I'm just going to be sitting here for ages trying to update the computer, so this is probably the worst part about setting everything up. But that's because the NVIDIA driver, which is for the 3090, doesn't work on old versions of Windows 10, so yeah, there's literally no way to avoid this part. But as long as it means that we can get everything working and set up to play some of the newest games. And also, I still have my code from Watch Dogs Legion, which actually came with the GPU. And I've not been able to activate that for like 1 or 2 months because this GPU has literally been sitting in my wardrobe. So hopefully the code hasn't run out, because I know that the promotion stopped and people who buy RTX cards don't get Watch Dogs Legion anymore, especially because it's a game from October. But I'm hoping that the code still works to redeem it, because otherwise I've just lost a free game that's worth like £50. So I've already installed the HD60 game capture driver. Now I'm actually installing the Elgato game capture HD software. So what this should do is it should actually install the software that I can use to actually capture the video input coming from the capture card. So for most people, they use capture cards to record game console footage, so stream PS4 or make PS4 videos. Personally, I'm using it so I can actually record this camera that I'm recording on. I'm going to plug a mini HDMI to HDMI cable into the camera and then into the capture card, and then I'm actually going to use that to have it as a face cam, hopefully to record with. So we'll see how that's set up a little later in the video. And along with that, I've actually got two monitors to actually work and function now, which they didn't before. So what I can go ahead and do is actually install this NVIDIA game driver, which is the latest one, which should support the RTX 3090. Before, it wouldn't actually install because we weren't updated to the newest Windows. We are actually on the newest Windows now, and this is official Microsoft Windows. I used the Microsoft tool to download it. I updated it through the Microsoft control panel. And have you noticed in the corner, there's no Activate Windows logo, which means I'm not going to have to put in a product key right now. But when that comes up, I'm going to have to try and find the product key that I bought like a month ago, and hopefully it'll work on this computer as well as the other one, because otherwise I'm going to have to buy a new Windows key. Or my PC will be a complete meme like with KSI, where he always has that please activate Windows logo in the bottom right. And that is the final PC build. So if you want to see the showcase of the whole setup, the link will be in the description below. I did a whole montage with music and the whole process of building the room and constructing the furniture, so you can watch that linked below. But if you enjoyed this PC guide and you want to see more gaming videos, then make sure to subscribe to the channel below and turn on notifications for more videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.